In this video, I'm going to discuss 3 topics that people have asked me about in comments to my channel. I'm going to talk about the role of pictures and videos in a disability exam, pacemakers and disability, and a topic I get a lot of requests for. I'm going to talk a little bit about malingering and functional illness. Hello, I'm John Foster. I'm a medical doctor who does Social Security disability exams. I've done quite a few, and as usual, everything I say reflects my own opinions based on my own experience and study, and not the opinions of the Social Security Administration or any other medical body. Now, the first topic is, when is it helpful to show pictures or videos to the disability exam doctor? And I'm going to lead off with when it is not helpful. The first problem is when I meet somebody and ask them to describe their disability, and they hand me their phone with a picture on it. It's much better to describe your problems as best you can to begin with. When a claimant is describing their problems to me, I'm not just focusing on what they're telling me about the problem. I'm also focusing on whether they can speak normally, whether they seem to have a good memory or an impaired memory, whether they can think coherently and stay on task, etc. And those are all very important work-related abilities as far as Social Security is concerned. The second thing is, disability is based on your condition now, not what your condition was like in the past. Often, people who were injured in a car wreck, for example, will want to show me a picture of the car that was wrecked, or a picture of them when they just got out of surgery. The first issue, showing me pictures of the wrecked car. I used to work in the emergency department of a trauma center, and the local EMS got the idea that it would be helpful for the emergency room doctors to see pictures of cars that had been in a wreck. Well, I soon realized that there really wasn't any correlation between the condition of the car and the condition of the people in the car. I would see a picture of a car that you would have thought nobody could have survived that wreck, and yet the person would just have some bumps and scrapes. And then I'd see a picture of a car that didn't look to be terribly damaged, and the person in it had very serious injuries. And that seemed to be the general consensus, because after about a year, they stopped bringing in pictures from car wrecks. If you were in an accident or if you had surgery, by the time you get to me, a disability doctor, it's probably been several years. So your initial pictures may have looked very gory and ghastly, but that's not what counts towards getting you approved for disability. What counts is your condition now. Now, when can pictures or videos be very helpful? Well, the first is when you have a condition that comes and goes. And if you do, it's best to get pictures when it's really bad. Here's a real example from a person I saw. I had a woman come in and tell me that she was disabled from lupus. And typically with lupus, people get a rash on their face and swollen, painful joints. And I examined this woman, and she had no rash and no swollen, painful joints. So I was kind of puzzled, because my impression of her was that she was a straight shooter. She was telling me the facts, but I couldn't see any signs of the condition she told me she had. So then she asked me if I'd like to see some pictures, and she showed them to me. When her lupus was bad, she had a very dramatic rash on her face and several very swollen red joints that I'm sure were painful. And that changed the whole picture for me, because it was obvious that she had severe attacks of lupus, and therefore I could put that in my report. Another real example, I had a man who had a hip fracture from an automobile accident and had had, I believe, 2 surgeries, and was complaining that it was very painful and he had all sorts of trouble standing and walking. Now, when I was an emergency room doctor, I saw many hip fractures, and I've also assisted on many hip fracture surgeries. And most hip fractures after surgery do pretty well. There may be some minor problems standing or walking, but not major. And this man was trying to describe what had happened to his hip, and he really wasn't getting the picture across to me. I couldn't figure out what was going on. So he asked me if I'd like to see a picture of his x-ray. And he showed me the x-ray, and that made everything crystal clear to me. It was the worst hip injury I've ever seen in my life. His hip wasn't just broken. It was destroyed, smashed into all sorts of pieces, and it was obvious there was no way to fix this hip so that he'd be able to stand and walk normally. So those are examples of when images are helpful. Now, one more thing about images. I've wasted so much time watching people scroll and scroll and scroll through their phone trying to find the picture they wanted to show me. I now have a rule: 3 minutes. If you can't find the picture in 3 minutes, I'm moving on. So I strongly advise that if you want to show pictures or videos, make sure you can locate them immediately. Put them in a folder. Now, the next topic is pacemakers, and we're talking about heart pacemakers here. A person asked me, what about pacemakers? Now, a pacemaker is an electrical device that makes the heart beat. And most of the time, it's used for when the heart beats too slowly, or when the heart will stop beating for a period and then resume beating normally. Now, when a person's heart beats too slowly, usually initially the person feels weak and faint. And if the heart beats too slowly or stops, the person will pass out, what doctors call syncope. So one of the reasons for putting in a pacemaker is if the person's having syncopal episodes, or what we call pre-syncope, which is almost but not quite completely passing out. Now the thing is, most of the time the pacemaker will fix that problem. The person will no longer pass out or nearly pass out, and therefore, in the eyes of Social Security, although they have a heart pacemaker, they are not disabled. There are 2 issues where Social Security may consider a person with a pacemaker disabled. The first is if the pacemaker doesn't stop all the episodes of syncope and or near syncope. In other words, the person has a pacemaker put in, and yet even so, they continue to have episodes of passing out or almost passing out. That's actually quite rare. The second thing is if they have severe underlying heart disease. Believe it or not, some people have hearts that seem to be perfectly fine with only one problem, that they beat too slowly or stop beating intermittently. They have no other underlying heart disease. But many people who need pacemakers have severe underlying heart disease. They've had 1 or more heart attacks, or they have heart failure, or other serious heart problems. In that case, the person may qualify for disability not because they have a pacemaker, but because of the other effects of their serious heart disease. I'm going to leave a link in the description to this video below to Social Security's listing of impairments for heart disease, where they talk about pacemakers. Finally, a lot of people seem to be fascinated by the topic of malingering, which is when people deliberately try to deceive the doctor and fake an illness or injury. And although I do see it regularly, that's relatively rare. Imaginary illness is called functional illness these days, and these are the different types I see in disability exams. The most common is exaggeration, where a person actually has medical problems, but they play them up to be a little bit worse than they actually are. And in many cases, I consider this normal and don't even put it in my report. You need to understand, people applying for disability are often in pretty bad circumstances. They may have run out of money, they may be facing bankruptcy, they may be facing homelessness, they may be very sick and unable to get medical care. And it takes a very long time to get a disability application processed. So when they come to their disability exam, I don't think it's abnormal for them to exaggerate a little bit in the hopes that that will help them get approved. On the other hand, if somebody is grossly exaggerating, making mountains out of molehills, that is a problem. The second most common are a type of functional illness which is divided into somatic symptom disorder and hypochondriasis, and I'm going to make a video about that in the near future. And these are people who really believe that they are ill when they actually aren't. They are not deliberately faking. Then the third most common is malingering. These are people who know that they're well, that there's nothing wrong with them, and decide that in order to get the benefits of Social Security disability, they're going to try to hoodwink the doctor and the Social Security Administration. These tend to be criminal types, and I see a fair number of people who've recently been released from prison, and some of them do this, but interestingly enough, the majority of the ex-convicts that I see are telling me the truth. They actually have serious medical problems or injuries and are not faking. Finally, the rarest type of person is the person who is psychotic, who is insane. And these people are out of touch with reality. They have delusions, which are false beliefs, and sometimes those delusions are that they are sick. An example would be a young woman who I saw quite some time ago who came to the emergency room saying she couldn't breathe through her nose. And when I examined her, I checked her nose and everything seemed to be fine and she could breathe perfectly through her nose, so I was puzzled. And I asked some more questions, and what it turned out was she believed that she had stopped breathing completely 3 months before she saw me. In other words, she believed that she died 3 months ago. There's actually a name for that. It's called Capgras syndrome. Now, there's very little written about malingering in the medical literature, and I believe that I've made some new discoveries. And my latest discovery, and I called it these signs, is what I call the refusal sign. And before I describe it, I want to say, you must be very careful before saying that somebody is a malingerer. The last thing you want to do is saying that someone who is actually sick is faking. I like to have at least 3 signs of malingering, and preferably more, before I'll say for sure that someone is faking. So here's the refusal sign. So far, over the last 8 years, I have never seen it in a person who wasn't malingering. And I'm going to describe 2 women that I saw on the same day. So the first was a younger woman who complained of pains all over the place. And when I'd finished taking her history, I asked her to get on the exam table, which involves stepping up one step and then sitting down on the table. And she told me she couldn't. And I asked her why, and she said she just couldn't. And she was very angry. And after a lot of persuasion, I managed to get her to sit on the table, which she did with no problem at all. Then I had another woman, late middle age, and one of her major problems was dizziness. And when I'd finished taking her history, I asked her to get on the table, and she said she didn't know if she could manage it. And I said, well, just give it a try. And so she did. And she tried to get on the table, and her first attempt was unsuccessful because she was dizzy. And her second attempt was unsuccessful because she was dizzy. And another problem was she was very heavy, and I was standing right next to her. But I thought, if she starts to fall, I may not be able to hold her up. She made one more try, unsuccessful, and I said, yeah, I can see that you're very dizzy and you can't get up on the table, so just sit back down in the chair and I'll examine you in the chair. Examining people in a chair is not ideal, but sometimes it's necessary, like when I get people in a wheelchair whose legs are paralyzed. So contrast these two people. The first one was angry and flat out refused to try, although when they finally did try, they performed the activity perfectly with no difficulty at all. The second person was kind of embarrassed. They wished they could get up on the table. They tried. They got nervous because they were so dizzy and were afraid they would fall, but they tried 3 times, and I finally told them to stop. The first person was a malingerer. The second person was not. The last thing a malingerer wants is to have their claimed illness or injury proven non-existent, and that's why they get angry when you ask them to do something that they claim they cannot. The second person was truly disabled, had a number of problems, but one of them was quite severe dizziness, and there are several things you can see on the exam that cannot be faked in dizzy patients, and she had some of them. And like most disabled persons, she was not happy about being disabled. She wanted to be in good health. She wanted to try and do the thing she was asked to do, even though she couldn't do it, and it turned out that it was kind of risky. So that's my new sign of malingering, and I call it the refusal sign. Well, I hope this has been helpful, and as always, remember, if it happens, it's possible.